The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
It is now 10 o'clock, and we would like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Caesar, and I will be your host for today. Today is February 9th, 2021, and you are here for the 2019 CBSC Intervening Code Cycle Updates. This is a second part in a two-part series, and we'll be covering the California Electrical Code, the California Mechanical Code, the California Plumbing Code, California Existing Building Code, where we're going to clarify a bit the OSHPD 1R provisions, and we're going to be going over some structural clarifications as they relate to Chapter 3A in the Building Code. You are here for roughly about an hour presentation with some question and answer at the end of the presentation. If you haven't done so already, please feel free to download the handouts for this presentation, which are in the handout section of the GoTo panel. Again, that's in the handout section of the GoTo panel. Or if you have problems doing that, if you have issues doing that, please feel free to email us at regsunit@oshpod.ca.gov. Again, that's regsunit@oshpod.ca.gov. If you are having wanting questions about a specific project that are not related to this presentation, please feel free to email us at that same email address, which is regsunit@oshpod.ca.gov. During this presentation, please keep your questions generic and type them into that question bar at the GoTo toolbox, and we'll go ahead and answer those questions at the end of the presentation. If you are experiencing transmission difficulties, please feel free to log off and log back in using the same login information that the GoTo software handed you and shared with you prior to logging in. For today, as presenters, we have Mr. Richard Tannehill. He's a senior architect and the Building Standards Unit Supervisor. We have Mr. Roy Lobo. He's a principal structural engineer with the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development. We have Mr. Bill Gao, senior electrical engineer with the office as well. And we have Dave Mason. He's a senior mechanical engineer with the office as well. So, Richard, if you're there, I hand the presentation over to you.
All right, thank you, Caesar. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to do a quick introduction here. As Caesar mentioned, this is the second of a two-part series for the 2019 California Building Code Intervening edition that comes into effect in July of this year. It was printed in January last month, so you have 6 months to review it, and it takes effect July 1st. Next slide. So for the first part of this session included the administrative code as well as the California Building Code and the structural portions of that in Volume 1, Volume 2, Part 2. I'm still looking at the title slide.
Yeah, Caesar, can you advance the slides? Apparently, I'm not able to.
No problem. Hold on. Richard, let me know. You should be looking at the next slide.
Yes, I am. Thank you. So today we're going to cover Part 3 is the electrical code, Part 4 mechanical code, Part 5 plumbing code, and we'll get into the Part 10, the existing building code for both architectural as well as structural. One of the things you'll see a lot of is the banner has removed the 1R symbol from the OSHPD 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in a lot of cases, not every case. And we just want to make it clear that the 1R is the building type or the type of building and not necessarily for the occupants going into that building. So once a building is removed from acute care service, it becomes a 1R building, and then you would apply any code for the occupants going into that building. So if it's a business or a clinic space, it's going to be an OSHPD 3. If it's a skilled nursing facility, it's going to be an OSHPD 2. So the OSHPD 1R would apply to anything serving that building as coming from the hospital, as well as the building itself, but not the occupancies. Okay, with that, we can go on to the next slide, and I believe this will be electrical. Oh, not electrical. Real quick, what we did, we kind of color coded the slides, so it makes it a little bit easier to understand what was there before as well as what's new. So anything in bold black text or regular text is existing text with no change. The underlined blue text is anything that was added new. If it has a red highlight, it's just really there for emphasis. Probably won't see a whole lot of that today. If it's a gray strikeout, that means that's the old text that was deleted. Anything in purple text is just for reference only. And again, you shouldn't see too much of that in this session. And with this, I'll turn it over to Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I'm here to present the mid-cycle changes for the California Electrical Code. And these changes are primarily housekeeping and clarification. There's not a lot of material, so I'll try to keep it brief. Next slide, please. Okay, so in Article 89, we have updated the definition for OSHPD 1R to include SBC or freestanding buildings. It includes either building. This change is also made in the building code. And so, again, this is just a housekeeping change. Next slide, please. In Article 110, we had an OSHPD amendment for approval. And OSHPD requires all equipment to be listed, labeled, and certified by a national recognized testing laboratory. We deleted this because in Article 110.3C, the model code requires all equipment to be listed as well. So for redundancy, we removed this. It could pose a problem, so after further discussion, we will be adding this back into the 2022 electrical code. But to be clear, OSHPD requires all equipment to be listed by a recognized testing laboratory as recognized by OSHA. The other change is an old requirement that's been in the code for a long time. For cleanup purposes, we are removing it. You still need to meet the anchorage and bracing requirements in the California building code. Next slide. Here we just, again, the first change in 517.1A is a pointer to the requirements for OSHPD 1R that are found in the existing building code, section 309. The second addition to the code is for electrical equipment schedules to clearly indicate what equipment is powered by the central electrical system and the appropriate special seismic certification for that equipment. And lastly, in 517.4, this is a building code reference to services and systems and utilities. We had added missing code references in 1225 and 1228. So again, just more cleanup. Next slide. Again, this here is the OSHPD amendment for the essential electrical systems for hospitals. Our requirement originally said that you needed to meet 517.29 through 30. This was caused by a model code change that was also incorrect. The correct reference is 517.29 through 517.35 are the requirements for the essential electrical system for hospitals. So again, more housekeeping. Next slide, please. Again, more cleanup work. in 517.123, you'll find the nurse call system requirements. We had a requirement for a psychiatric nursing unit in 517.123A5. We're removing that requirement because it's redundant. 517.123 already has requirements for psychiatric nursing units in 123F. So again, just cleanup work. Next slide, please. In the model code, in Article 517.30, fuel cells were added as a acceptable alternative power source for the essential electrical system. We failed to add at the time a requirement for the amount of on-site fuel that is required when fuel cells are used. So we added this exception that points to the fuel requirements that you'll find for generators in Article 700.12B2. So if you're using a fuel cell as an alternate power source, it needs on-site fuel, just like a generator. I will note that CMS still uses NFPA 99/2012 and references NFPA 110/2010, both of which require generators for the alternate power source. So we won't be seeing much fuel cells being used as the primary source of the essential electrical system, but the code is being updated. So in the future, next slide. And we removed OSHPD from the OSHPD banner 1R in the following sections. And this again was just cleanup. When the 2019 code came out, 1R was added to all the OSHPD banners. That wasn't correct. And so again, we're just doing cleanup. And that should be all my changes for the California Electrical Code.
Thanks, Bill. Before we get into mechanical, just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, go ahead and post them in the chat for the question box on your dashboard. Dave?
Okay. Thank you, Bill. This is Dave Mason, Senior Mechanical Engineer at OSHPD in the Building Standards Unit. I work with Bill and Richard, and today I will be taking you through the mechanical and plumbing changes in the intervening code cycle. And there might be a little bit of housekeeping in some of my changes, but we don't even cover all of that here. There were just rows. So, okay, application here. Am I driving this now, Caesar?
I will go ahead and advance the slides for you, Dave.
Thank you. Okay. OSHPD 1 and 1R. That's a recurring theme here. And with general acute care hospitals, non-conforming hospital or SBC or freestanding that have been removed from acute care service. I know Richard's already talked about this quite a bit. So I'm going to skip and go to the next slide, Caesar. Okay, once again, authority having jurisdiction, AHJ. You see the 1R is added there, and we just did some housekeeping on 4 and 5. Next slide, Caesar. Okay. General requirements. We have 3017 for general closet and alcove installations. The main thing we want to look at here is that there was some old kind of odd language in both model code and OSHPD language for closet or alcoves, basically boiler installations. And at one point it looked like Atmo had actually changed the title of this paragraph and didn't change the substance of the paragraph. So overall, it was kind of it was tough to enforce and tough to follow, tough to understand. So we went through and we kind of gutted this, and we actually moved the language up to a more modern, useful standard. This is addressed later in the mechanical code, which we'll come to. But here you see we're lining out a bunch of this language that was kind of a challenge for everybody. Next slide, please. Okay. We had okay. Looks like we're skipping one there. Caesar, can you move it back one? Let's try that again. Okay, there we go. On our end here, we're dealing with some lag, so the slides might move around a little bit on us. But here we see the building automation systems. This is a whole new section. What we were looking for is localized control in the event of a network failure. You know, these systems with the BAS obviously work on networks. In the circumstance there's a network failure, we basically, in working language, we want hand control capability on large components of the system should the network go down. That's all it's really what we're looking for here. Okay, we have we update some referrals to the building code. That's just keeping us in alignment with the changes there. 320.3.1, we just do some more housekeeping here. We had a little, looks like a typo or a misuse of some of the language. And at 320.4, we just clarify the title, Telephone and Technology Equipment Centers, to get that terminology right. Now, a more substantive change here with 320.4.4, Technology Equipment Center shall have redundant cooling systems, each of sufficient capacity to provide required cooling during periods of breakdown or maintenance of either system. One system shall be non-hydronic and on essential power. So what we're looking for there is very strong redundancy. And this was really initiated because OSHPD is very interested in the maintenance and safety of data in these facilities, obviously. So that change was put into the mechanical code. Next slide, please. Okay. With section 320.1, our language was really specific that we need heating equipment on essential, but we didn't specifically state fans also. In most facilities, the fans are on essential power because they are used to pressurize different spaces. So in that case, there's a requirement for fans to be on essential power. In the rare instance that the fans may not be required to be on essential power, we're saying here that they still need to be on essential power in order to deliver the hot air. So that's all we're doing. There's just a minor clarification. Same thing with 320.2 and 323. What we're looking for here is we're giving some direction to the mechanical engineers of record, saying on the schedules, please include what things on the schedules need to be on essential power, and OSP, seismic certs that are required for different pieces of equipment. Even in reviewing our projects, typically we've got to go into the electrical drawings to see that these are specified correctly for essential power. Sometimes it's in the specs. It's not always clear in the drawings. This will make it clear for everybody using the drawings. Next slide, please. Okay. Ventilation air. Yeah, we did a little housekeeping here. You can see we lined out where it says not permitted for OSHPD on 402.0. Actually, OSHPD does apply within section 402. And that was a change that we had missed all the way back in 2016. And I looked at it with my former supervisor, Glenn, about a year ago. And we looked at each other and said, what were we thinking? We should have picked that up. So that was cleaned up. So as you get into section 402, occupiable spaces, we say, it's occupiable spaces listed in table 402.1. That's model code, and that's for non-medical spaces. So we add also spaces in table 4A. Those will be ventilated per this code section. We make that clear here. So we removed the reference to FGI just to clean up the language. And at 402.1.3, we get pretty specific. We say ventilation rates for areas not specified in 4A shall have minimum ventilation and air change per ASHRAE 62.1. Where areas with prescribed ventilation rates in both standards exist in 62.1 and table 4A, the higher of the two shall be used. So the language in the model code, just for everybody's information, is basically adopted and copied right out of 62.1 for non-medical spaces for ventilation rates. So that's kind of the background on that. And hopefully this will add clarification and help them in the directions they need to go. Next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, there's some areas in model code in 62.1 style ventilation that do not apply to healthcare. And they're basically kind of omitted in ASHRAE 170. So we're trying to show that here. Some of the sections just do not apply. I think it's 402.3 even says, you know, we have occupancy sensor type of requirements and things like that. These things just don't apply. So we said some of these sections within 402 just do not apply. In system details, we have 407.4.1.7. Now, what we're doing here with this language is we are just mimicking the requirements of ASHRAE 170, essentially. That's what we're trying to do here, add clarification, make sure we don't violate 170. The other thing, too, to think about for any designers out there is this kind of helps grease the rail, so to speak, on the use of chill beam technology in the future. So any mechanicals out there, look at this new change to 407.4.1.7 and think about it in that light. I think you'll see the value in that. So where spaces in 4A permits air to be recirculated by room units, the portion of the minimum total air change per hour required for a space is greater than minimum outdoor air changes per hour. Those air changes above the outdoor requirement can be provided by this, provided they have these three components. Shall not receive unfiltered, unconditioned outdoor air, only serves a single space, and provide filtration per section 408.2, 408.3 for air passing over any surfaces designed to condense water. That's obviously an infection control issue, and it mimics the requirements of ASHRAE 170. And we'll get to that here in a second. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we're doing here under filters, all we're really trying to do here is we are trying to not contradict the requirements in ASHRAE 170. We're trying to get ourselves really in line with that. So you see actually a reduction in a MERV rating at 408.2.2. So that's all we're doing here with these.
Hey, Dave, I don't know if you're still there. I can't, looks like we lost audio. Dave, you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we lost you for a little bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I thought I was going to check. So anyway, as I just said, hopefully I got through that. The changes here are not very substantive, and the MERV ratings are not very difficult to achieve. They just are in alignment with ASHRAE 170. So, okay, Caesar, if you can hear me, we'll go to the next slide now. Can you hear me, Caesar? There you go. Okay. Little lag here, but we got it. Okay. 408.2.4, we're just once again adding clarification. Filtration for these units shall have a filter with minimum efficiency of 6 versus 1. Yeah, we had MERV 1 in there for non-central recirculating air handling systems. And once again, we're just getting in alignment with ASHRAE 170. And the MERV 1 was always kind of funny to me. We just call that a rock catcher. Really doesn't accomplish much. So we refined that a little bit. Then when we talk about skilled nursing facilities, that's handled in mechanical code with really a different kind of different section altogether in terms of filtration. But once again, we're doing away with the rock catcher filter and going with a MERV 6, okay, for ASHRAE 170 requirements. Next slide, please. Okay. Here we just have sections mainly where we're removing the 1R from the banner. I don't have much more to say about that, so we'll go to the next slide, Caesar. Yeah, the only thing I would add to that really is just so the designers out there know, when we're looking at a facility that's been converted to 1R, mechanical engineers at Oshpod, we're really looking for what are you doing in the space and occupancy. That's really what drives these requirements. So I just got a call last night on a facility that was being changed into all office space administrative. Well, we see something like that. We don't see an issue with plenary returns, things like that. But if you've got an operating room suite in there, then we do see an issue with it. So that's what we're doing at Oshpod in a nutshell in terms of mechanical. So we're always willing to work with you and be flexible on that. This is really the most substantive change here. In Table 4A of Mechanical Code, we removed the 100% outdoor air column. And we did that because there was an old legacy allowance that was in our code that was allowed to last for a while. And we're supposed to meet ASHRAE 170. And in order to keep us in compliance with the requirements needed per CMS, well, this column wasn't valid. This column wasn't valid because it allowed changes per hour for 100% outdoor air systems. And recent past, ASHRAE made it very clear that that's not valid. So we have to comply with the ASHRAE 170 requirements, ASHRAE 170 2008, in order to make sure facilities are qualified for CMS funding. That's kind of important, of course, because it's a big chunk of the funding. So in order to remove that pitfall, we did omit this column from Table 4A. And so we'll go to the next slide, please. Okay, what we've done here is we had several changes to the footnotes in Table 4A. I've just pulled out a couple that I thought were pretty important. We should let you know that they've occurred. And that is in compounding, we are including the pressure differential requirements between the different rooms in compounding suites. It can be kind of hard to dig that stuff out of the USP requirements. USP requirements kind of read like Gone with the Wind, I've found, and it's difficult to be a designer and use those documents. So we continue to try to help the designers serve up some of the really important information in an easy to use way. That's all we're doing here. Okay. So next slide, please. Okay. The other thing too, you'll see 507.7 USP, when they address this issue of how to configure the exhaust outlets for compounding, including hazardous, we saw some pretty funny examples on that. So we decided to make this a little clearer. And we found in California, we've got a lot of really good designers in the state, and they were doing this anyway. They were designing exhaust discharges that were safe and effective, and we just borrowed from all those excellent designs, and we clarified this in the code. Okay, we will go to, let's see, duct systems. Yeah, this is fine. We just have a clarification. The language is 604.2. We'll go to the next slide, please. Okay, here's where we readdress the installation of boilers question that we took out earlier. I think it was in chapter 3, and lined out that language for Oshpod that was confusing. And just so you know, the NFPA requirements for how to install boilers is advanced, gotten clearer, and the IATMO language has kind of lagged. So what we've done here is we've inserted this new language in the chapter on boilers. And this is the useful information we're looking for. You know, when we're reviewing projects, we don't see boilers going in that are not listed. They're all listed. And essentially, we're looking for just a safe installation that's not overly burdensome, and that the designer and construction crews install per the listings for this type of equipment. That's all we're looking for here. So hopefully this will be helpful and easier for everybody. Next slide, please. Okay, refrigeration. We've gone a little bit outside the envelope on this one. What we're trying to do here is we say for technology equipment centers not attached to a patient care area, the amounts shown in table 1102.2 may be calculated at 100%. So you know, in general, in the chapter 11 on refrigeration, when you have an high occupancy, it says, hey, your the amounts of refrigerant you can use in these facilities is you've got to take that max allowable and cut it in half. And what we're finding is there's a lot of systems being proposed, like variable refrigerant systems, that are excellent for cooling IT rooms and stuff like this. And we found those were just not being allowed in a lot of instances where they would be perfectly safe. That's all we're trying to do here. We're trying to give the healthcare providers and designers more options on these types of systems. They'll help conserve energy, and there's no reason why they can't be installed in these technology equipment centers not attached to patient care areas. So that's all we're doing there, and we got zero negative input on that in the public comment period, which was really nice. Next slide, please. Okay, next we'll go to the plumbing code. We will, well, as you'll see, we'll be addressing the one issue that comes up every cycle except this current cycle, and that's hand wash fixtures. That's kind of an OSHPD favorite, it seems. So we'll go to this next slide here. We've got, once again, it's getting into some of the language on 1R, non-conforming hospital, SBC, or freestanding buildings. This is just clarification of the language. Housekeeping, as Bill would say. We'll go to the next slide, please. Okay, there it is. The infamous hand washing fixture section. This is in definitions in chapter 2. And this is really interesting. You know, there's certain things we want to make very, very clear with hand wash fixtures as mechanical engineers working at OSHPD. These basically are, in our mind, they are not sinks or labs, but these words remain in the definitions due to the heavy, I would call it the architectural influence that we have with our work at OSHPD with our fellow architects. So the change from sink to laboratory, just so you know, all the architects out there, and we've got a lot of them tuned in, please look at the 11B requirements on knee, foot room and knee room in 11B of the building code. Because with a sink, you have a minimum requirement away from the wall. With a laboratory, you have a maximum requirement away from the wall. So get familiar with those. The infection control aspects are in the next line here, where we say have fittings such that all controls can be operated without the use of hands. This is something we're always looking for. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have wrist blades. You can, in a lot of cases, have wrist blades. But if it's a hand wash fixture, we don't want you touching it with your fingertips and your hands due to infection control concerns. And D down here, faucets shall be equipped with gooseneck spouts. A gooseneck spout should be a deck or fixture mounted so the discharge point of the spout return is at least 10 inches above the bottom of the basin. Water should not flow directly from the spout into the drain. Gooseneck spout shall have a 180-degree return with constant radius and the outlet pointing vertically down. Now, all these things are founded in infection control. That last statement, though, the 180-degree return, I do know that we'll have some fixtures proposed that are maybe 170-degree. And we'll look at those. We'll try to be as flexible as we can because there's a lot of fixtures like that. The 10-inch requirement, 10 inches above the bottom of the basin, I did an analysis of all the equipment out there that's being sold and offered, and that does not adversely affect the market in any way. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Also, for what it's worth, temperature controls. We've had a lot of fixtures proposed with fingertip temperature controls at the base. And once again, like I said earlier, that involves something other than a wrist blade. So the dirtiest parts of our hands are our fingertips. So we're trying to avoid that. Okay, the next section here shall be designed and installed to prevent splashing outside of the lavatory. We're just trying to stick with the same language there. Shall be well fitted and sealed to prevent water leaks into the cabinetry or wall spaces. Design of lavatories and cabinetry should not permit storage beneath the fixture basin. I see that violated quite a bit, actually, even in existing facilities out there. So, shall be constructed of non-porous material. So, okay, next slide, please. Okay, floor drains, waste traps, and we add here sanitary drainage cleanouts. We add that to the prohibition for operating in delivery rooms. So we don't want cleanouts in these spaces. Actually, I don't think I've ever seen one, maybe just once. proposed. So 310.12, we have, once again, we're just making sure we're correlating correctly to the building code. And plumbing equipment schedules is very similar to what we had in the mechanical code. We want to make sure that on the schedules themselves have a check mark there saying, hey, this needs to be on essential power, and or this requires special seismic certification. That'll be much easier for everybody involved in the construction of these facilities. And it'll make them easier to review too. So next slide, please. Okay. Okay. Yeah, 613.2. I was repeatedly surprised how hard this is to understand, I guess. It was confusing beforehand, so we made it very concise. We're looking for redundancy in the hot water equipment arrangement. So we say here the arrangement of water heating equipment shall be based on the capacity and capability of the equipment to provide the required hot water during periods of breakdown or maintenance of any one water heater. So, you can have 3 water heaters, and 2 of them at any time, any configuration, be capable to carry the load. You can go from 3 to 2, you can go from 2 to 1 during maintenance or breakdown, as long as you meet that load during taking one unit down. That's what we're trying to get after here. Healthcare facilities, medical gas, and medical vacuum systems. Okay. Yeah, this is an interesting one. It's kind of tough to wordsmith it, but it says here, a medical gas source system serving an OSHPOD 1, 2, 3, or 5 building shall not be located in an OSHPOD 1R or OSHPOD 3 building. OSHPOD 1R buildings may be served by an individual main supply line from other OSHPOD buildings with a main valve as per NFPA 99. Valve should be accessible and clearly labeled. What we're looking for here is that if we have a building that doesn't meet the seismic requirements OSHPOD's trying to get in these facilities, we don't want the source to go down with a building that's taken down by a seismic event and take out the medical gas serving other areas that are very important. You can imagine that can be an issue. So that's what we're trying to address here with this language. And ongoing, I welcome any comments from the public on this too. If we can refine it further or answer questions, we'll do that. So next slide, please. That's what I had for mechanical and plumbing. I did not get a chance to rehearse it. I finished the slides about bedtime last night. So hopefully you found that useful, and look forward to answering questions at the end of this.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, this is Richard again. We're going to go hit part 10 now. Caesar, can you do me a favor and move the pointer off the screen? Thank you. Again, you've seen this on all of them. We basically add non-conforming SPC or freestanding hospital for the application of buildings removed from acute care service. Next slide, please. Okay, for the scope, for general scoping, unless otherwise expressly stated, the following words and terms and purpose of this code have meanings shown in this chapter. So they're going to have their own definitions in this chapter. For other definitions, we're just pointing back to part 1, chapters 6 and 7, and part 2, chapter 2 for further definitions. In this part 10, under general definitions, we're adding a definition for building official, as well as a code official. And basically, they can be used interchangeably. The reason for this is because they show up differently in different sections of the code. And so we just want to make sure that they both can be used interchangeably or interpreted interchangeably. Next slide. We added previously in past code, we made some changes to the definition of substantial structural damage. What we didn't realize, we were changing it to model code as well. So we put this back to its original intent. And next slide, please. And we added a new section that was OSHPOD specific, and basically says the same thing that this used to say in this new language here. And it has the same reductions. So basically, nothing has really changed from last code for healthcare, but we just put back model code language that was mistakenly changed. Next slide. One of the things that in the existing building code that was mistaken under 305.1, we were referencing for accessibility to use this section, and we added not adopted by OSHPD to section 305. And at the same time, 305A, which only applies to OSHPD 1 facilities, had a whole list of accessibility features, and we basically eliminated all that text and just pointed back to part 2 of the building code, chapter 11B. Next slide. Okay, a lot of what we did with this code, we added the 1R at the beginning of the 2019 cycle, and we put a lot of it under 309A, which is once a building is removed from acute care service, it's no longer considered a hospital. So that would be under the non-A chapters. So we basically restructured a lot of chapter 3, specifically section 309, to better align with that concept. So we moved a lot of language from 309A into, and 310A, actually 310A in its entirety, into 309, because again, the A chapters are specific to hospitals. So 309A has been retitled to hospital SPC and freestanding buildings. You've seen that a lot in every application of each part. We wanted to clarify that it does apply to an SPC building as well as a freestanding building removed from general acute care services and remaining under the jurisdiction of OSHPD. And basically that's what all of this language says. Designation OSHPD 1R shall be limited to provisions applicable to the overall hospital SPC and freestanding building. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the 1R is a building type and not applied to the occupancy. This also has been relocated from section 310A, moving it into the 309 section, basically states that a general acute care hospital shall conform with the requirements of 1.10.1, which is now a 1R building. It also states what qualifies as a freestanding building, as well as 309.1.3 is all the access points into a hospital SPC buildings removed from the general acute care shall prominently display signage at each access stating that no general acute care services beyond this point. So they have to delineate when you're leaving the hospital and entering a non-hospital building. We actually already had confusion with pharmacies that are required to be in the hospital building being relocated in a non-hospital building. So this is to help clarify that point. And again, just to remind you that section 310A was rewritten and incorporated in 309 to just better align with a non-hospital use. For definitions for freestanding and SPC building, we're pointing back to part 1 and part 2 for definitions. And buildings, 309.3 is buildings to remain under OSHPD jurisdiction, at identifying when freestanding buildings can qualify for non-acute care services. And to qualify for non-acute care services, they must be considered outpatient clinical services. And as listed here, these are some examples of what would be considered outpatient clinical service. You have administrative space, central sterile supply, storage, morgue, employee dressing room and locker rooms, janitorial and housekeeping, and laundry. Next slide. And these are the qualifying services for what can go into a 1R building. In addition to those outpatient portions of the following services that can see no more than 25% inpatient are your surgical departments, would be outpatient surgical in this case, chronic dialysis, psychiatry, rehab, maternity, dentistry, and chemical dependency. All these things can go into a 1R building and see up to 25% inpatient use. Services that duplicate basic services. So if you have a pharmacy in the main hospital but want to expand it into the 1R building or have another addition or a separate lab, for example, that can be done as long as it's above and beyond what's required for basic services that's already in the hospital building. All hospital support services listed in section 309.3.1, item A, that are located in an SPC building at the time of general acute care services, that the time that general acute care services are removed may remain. Okay, provided that CDPH certifies to OSHPD that it has received and approved a plan that demonstrates how the health facility will continue to provide all basic services in the event of the emergency when the SPC building may no longer remain functional. Next slide. Again, these are all requirements of a building that's removed from acute care service and what can go into them. Now, we continue to explain that in SPC, as opposed to a freestanding building, an SPC, non-general acute care hospital building containing non-acute care services under an existing license may be permitted under the following conditions. Existing approved non-acute care services shall be permitted to remain. The enforcing agency may require evidence that the existing occupancies and services are in compliance at the time they were located in the SPC building. Kind of goes to the remodel that if they were built in compliance with the code when they were built, they may be able to continue to be used. Okay, if an SPC building removed from general acute care services can be allowed to have other services in there, but they must be in excess of the minimum requirements for licensure and operation of the acute care hospital. So that's where I was going back to, like, say, an example for storage. You can have storage in the existing hospital, and you must meet the requirements for storage in that hospital. If you want to expand that storage for the hospital, it can be in the SPC building or the 1R building. Okay. New non-acute care services listed in 309.3.1, which we looked at earlier, item A, shall be permitted provided they are in excess of the minimum services required for licensure or operation. Again, you still need to meet all the requirements for basic services in the hospital building, and the non-acute care hospital can have additional uses that are in excess of what was required. The items in item B that we discussed, the morgue and all that, these services require compliance with the current functional requirements for that service as defined. So what this says is if you have same use and it's the same functional, we're looking at the functional requirements for that. So you just need to make sure that all the functional elements are there. So that allows these older facilities or older buildings to be used for these purposes without upgrading them all. New non-acute care services in item C shall be permitted provided they are in excess of the minimum service required for licensure. Okay, if patients are served by this service, it must meet the current functional requirements for that service. Again, we're looking if you're reusing a patient unit, an old med-surg unit for outpatient observation, a lot of the functional requirements are already in place. They don't need to meet current code. As long as they were installed in compliance at the time they were built, they can continue to be reused. Next slide. Okay. Sorry, this is a little bit long, but some of these points they come up as questions all the time. If you have an SPC, non-acute care building, containing a change of licensed nursing service under an existing license, the change of service for or function for all or a portion of that building removed from general acute care service requires compliance with the functional requirements for that service. Again, we're going to be looking at, you have all the components, the soil utility, clean utility, anything that's required for that service. This is, again, to give a lot of liberties to reusing these older buildings without a complete remodel. If you're doing intermediate care or skilled nursing, which can go in a 1R building, you must meet the requirements for that space. If it's intended to be used as a distinct part facility, you must comply with the current functional requirements as defined in Part 2, 122438, which is your intermediate care, or 122440, which is your skilled nursing facility in a hospital, and 307A, and that's your utilities. But you do still need to meet the accessibility requirements for that space. So in this case, you would need 50% accessibility. Same with psychiatric services in the 1R. You'd still need to meet the functional requirements, so that patient room sizes may not be an issue, but you do need to provide all the functional requirements, the consult rooms, whatever would be required, isolation or observation rooms required in a psychiatric facility would still need to be provided. Next slide. Yeah, we're almost done with this. For SPC non-acute buildings containing occupancies and their uses, basically this is saying that subject to the approval of the building official, in this case would be OSHPD, the use or occupancy of this existing buildings is allowed to be occupied for purposes in other groups or within the same group, provided the new or proposed use is less hazardous based on life and fire risk than the existing use. So again, another way of allowing a lesser risk use be put into a hospital building that does not have acute care. And then the vacant space is actually kind of cannibalized from another section from 309A, which has the requirements listed for vacant spaces. And you must submit a project to the office to show that that remediation is being done. And this is basically capping off any exposed plumbing systems and things that aren't being used in that space. Next slide. Okay, this one we're moving into the 309A. So this is specific to hospital buildings. So this is the process of removing the hospital building from the hospital. So that's why it's in the A chapter. It's still considered part of the hospital. So the provisions of this section shall apply to a hospital, SPC freestanding building that it is being intended to be removed from a general acute care service. Removal of these buildings shall satisfy the requirements of this section and the California Building Standards Code. Okay, OSHPD approval is required and a building permit is required for this removal. And typically we see it come in as a series of projects to get to the final conformance documents. Okay, if a building remaining under OSHPD jurisdiction, the SPC and freestanding buildings removed from acute care service actually have to remain under OSHPD jurisdiction. And vacated these, actually we already went over both 309A4 and A6 just in the slide before this, and this is just a pointer back to those sections for vacated spaces and buildings remaining under OSHPD jurisdiction. Next slide. So now we're going to switch over to Roy to go over the site structural components of this.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I am Roy Lobo. I'm the principal structure engineer with OSHPD. right now we're going to be talking about the code changes to to part 10. Basically, we made only one structural change, and that's to chapter 3A, and that is related to building separations. These are basically adjacent buildings, which we want to make sure that if you have a building that is SPC1 or SPC2, and you're trying to upgrade that building to an SPC4D performance category, then there is an adjacent building check that needs to be verified. And and sometimes, we find that we have all these buildings adjacent to each other, and they may not meet the adjacent building criteria that is specified in the California Administrative Code. And you said, okay, if you don't meet those criteria, then what do you do? And if you looked at the provisions in ASC 41 for adjacent buildings, there's a building separation requirement, and that requirement and the exceptions from doing a pounding analysis check was different from what is there in the California Administrative Code. So we currently have buildings that are SPC4, SPC5 that would not meet the criteria given in ASC 4113 for building separation. So we are saying, okay, we're going to convert buildings that are SPC1 and SPC2 to SPC4D that do not meet the adjacent building criteria. But I'm just saying, which will be different now between what ASC 41 is saying and the California Administrative Code is saying. Now, for example, you have buildings that where the floors do not line up, right? As the figure on the right, I don't know if my mouse works here, but the figure on the right hand side will show you where your floors do not line up, or you have buildings that are of different heights. You could have pounding impacting the building and causing the upper building to collapse on the lower building. So when you have those conditions, then you need to do a pounding evaluation, or you need to increase your building separation. So those are what you have to do. But a lot of times, the floors line up, and it's also very difficult to make a change to add a building separation for two existing buildings. So both buildings are existing. To make that change is sometimes difficult. So we said, okay, how are you going to do a pounding analysis? What is the evaluation for that? And taking all those into consideration, we said, okay, we are going to say we do not need to do a pounding evaluation when you do not meet the building deficiency as defined in the CAC, but there are certain other criteria that you need to meet. Okay. Now, just as I just said earlier, I may not have said it very clearly, was that the requirements in ASC 41 are different from the requirements in the CAC for adjacent buildings. So we tried to align it more to what the CAC said, but at the same time, we want to make sure that those requirements would meet the performance objective for SPC4D. Next slide. Okay, so what are the requirements for getting an SPC4D building from an SPC1 or SPC2? So there are three criteria that need to be satisfied. First of all, it needs to meet the damage control structural performance level at the BAC1E. What is the BAC1E? BAC1E is the 20% in 50-year design earthquake, and we are still sticking with the ASC 4113, which then references the ASC 710, and then so the ground motions are locked to that period in time. So it's the 20% earthquake, 20% in 50-year earthquake that we are targeting for the BAC 1D level as defined in ASC 710. And then we are also targeting the collapse prevention for a BAC 2E earthquake, which is the 5% in 50 years. Okay, so we've locked the ground motion, so we're not going to change that. So if you meet these criteria, then your building can be classified from SPC1 to SPC2. And then in addition to that, you need to meet the Article 10 deficiencies as specified in the California Administrative Code at the BAC 1E level. So those are the criteria to be satisfied. And if you do that, then your building can be reclassified from SPC1 or SPC2 to SPC4D. Now, next slide. So, but in order to do that, one of the requirements to meeting those criteria for AAC 41 is building separations. So, and if you do not have the necessary seismic separation for AAC 41, then you have to do what is called a pounding analysis. Okay, so if you do not meet these requirements, you need to do pounding analysis. Now, how do you evaluate a pounding analysis? How do you justify that your pounding analysis, after a pounding analysis, your building is still going to be okay? That's kind of difficult to do. So we said, is there a subset of buildings that we can say, meets the California Administrative Code, does not meet the requirements in AAC 41-13, but we can say, for those buildings, we do not need to do a pounding evaluation. So we said seismic separation is deemed to comply with SPC 4D requirements, and a pounding analysis is not required when either A or B apply. Next slide. So item A is if the building was constructed using the 1989 or later edition of the California Building Code. So these are basically buildings that are SPC 5 buildings. So if the building was an SPC 5 building, that means it's already assumed that the adjacent building deficiency in the CAC was already satisfied. Therefore, we said, what? If the adjacent building to the SPC1 is an SPC 5, we're assuming that condition has already been satisfied. We're not going to check it to reclassify the SPC 1 or 2 buildings to SPC 4D. Okay, so then the only other criteria is that if it meets the requirements of the CAC, Chapter 6, Section 3.4, then we said, is that good enough, or are there other criteria we need to add? Next slide. So it said if it meets these, then what other additional criteria do we need to add to say that you do not need to do a pounding analysis per AAC 41? And we came up with these criteria. So the first one was that the structural resisting system of the adjacent building is different. The masses of the more flexible building is no greater than 50% of the mass of the stiffer building. So that's what we put in there. That's going to change. I'm going to be talking about that. And then the second criteria was that if you do not have what's called a fatal flaw in a building, such as load path, weak story, soft story, vertical discontinuity, or torsion, that means these are basically, if you have your building has any of these vulnerabilities, then it is susceptible to collapse in an earthquake. So that means you said your adjacent building to the one that you're going to retrofit to SPC 40 does not have any of these, and it satisfies the requirement in the CAC, then you do not need to do a pounding evaluation. Okay, so that was the criteria that was decided to say that, okay, these are the additional requirements by which you can avoid doing a pounding evaluation. Next slide. So what are the new updates coming? Okay, so the new updates are coming. Again, these are for the buildings being classified to SPC 4D using AAC 41, and the same 3 criteria apply. Next slide. So the exemptions in AAC 41, were different from the ones that we just introduced into the 2019 mid-cycle. But what I just showed you, people were having difficulty in understanding, or the location we put those changes did not really capture the intent of what we were trying to do. So we said the exemptions in AAC 41, we're going to replace that whole section. We just added on to that. In addition to the exemptions you have here, you will put this third exemption. We said we're going to delete all of that. We're going to replace that whole section with this new section. Okay, so the new exemptions are now given here. We said, first of all, the building was constructed in 1989 or later, so that means an SPC 5 building. But then we didn't clarify that it has to be under OSHPD jurisdiction and the minimal. And so if it is an OSHPD building, then you do not need to meet the minimum separation requirements. And we said we want to make sure that this only applies to buildings reclassified to SPC 4D, and SPC 4D has a performance objective of damage control at a BAC 1E. So we said it need not be evaluated for structural performance levels for damage control or lower, that means damage control, life safety, or collapse, right? So then you don't need to do that if it's an SPC 5 building. Next slide. And the other requirement was that we removed the requirement, where the masses are different, and there's and that there are different lateral force resisting systems, because people were having difficulty in trying to identify and doing that evaluation between the two buildings. So it was becoming a little bit of a challenge to do that. So we said we're just going to delete that additional requirement. It has to meet the requirements in the CAC, and then it also has to meet additional requirements that I showed earlier. At the same time, we said, okay, if we don't meet those requirements, then what is the building separation? Are we just going to go with, that means in order to meet the requirements in AZ 41, you need to calculate what that separation was. So we said, okay, we will clarify that. And we said, if you meet the building separation of 2 inches per floor per the CAC, then that will be good enough. So if your adjacent building met that separation and it also was not considered immediately adjacent, then you need not do a pounding analysis. And then all the other requirements that we specified in the 2019 building in the mid-cycle code will remain. So that is, if your building should also not have these fatal flaws like load part, weak story, soft story, etc. Next slide. So we said that if you cannot meet your separation distance, right, then you can, there's a third path, right? Then you will do a pounding analysis. So we started with, when is your pounding analysis not required? And then I said, these are the exceptions from that. And then if you do not meet those criteria, you fall into the criteria that your building is less than half as tall, or your floors do not line up, then you have to do a pounding analysis. But now, for those conditions, I would recommend that you actually do a building separation if it's possible, otherwise the pounding analysis. And if you do a pounding analysis, then you will have to show that the buildings are capable of transferring those forces without collapse, or you don't, for each of these criteria. So with that, next slide, I'm done.
All right, thank you, Roy, for that, and everybody who presented good information. We're hoping that everyone is gaining some insight as to what's going on within OSHPD, and we're able to clarify some issues. If you still have questions about what we presented, or if you have a question about a specific project that you're looking to get clarification on, please email us at that email address that you see on your screen, regsunit@oshpd.ca.gov. Again, that's REGS unit@OSHPD. And we want to thank everyone who has taken the time to submit questions within the go-to panel question box. So now we're going to go ahead and answer those questions in the order that we receive them. So first question that we have, going back to mechanical code, Dave, if you're still there, reads, in reference to section 306.2 of the CMC, how would you expect engineers to prove this? If okay, just mentioned in the spec, or want it on the control diagram, or SOO spelled out on the plans?
Dave might have got cut off. He's trying to re-log in.
Okay, well, we can come back to that question. We can go ahead and Moving on to
From his.
the next set of questions. Going back to I believe, Richard, this may be yours.
I'll make up stuff for Dave.
Yeah, I know. So we'll go. How about a hospital with inpatient pharmacy and OSHPD 1 building? Can compounding services be provided in the RACS building?
No. What it is that if the pharmacy is serving the patients in the hospital, the pharmacy and the compounding has to be located in the hospital it's serving. Because if something happens in an event and that building goes down for some reason or is unable to get access to the hospital, they still need to be able to treat the patients. So for a pharmacy, we're seeing a lot of retail pharmacies put in RACs, as well as just a redundant or satellite pharmacy. But if they have to meet the minimum requirements for the compounding for their patients in the hospital building.
Great, thank you, Richard. We have another question for you, Richard. This is dealing with Part 10, section in reference 309.3.5. What's the deadline for submitting a project? In general, humidity control has been applied for a sensitive area, and I'll stop there because it looks like that's a Dave question. But going back to Part 10, what's the time deadline for submitting a project?
For a vacant space?
The question does not clarify. Actually, it does. It says to mitigate a vacant space hazard.
Yeah, when a vacant space project, there's no defined time limit, but basically, if you're doing a project, you have a vacated space in there. You either want to include the protections in that space as part of the original project or do a separate project. If there's something going back in there immediately following, you don't need to worry about it. But if it's going to remain vacant, a lot of times we'd like to see, we do require that you do submit something to close that space up to make it safe to be unoccupied. It kind of sounds kind of redundant or weird to say that safe when unoccupied, but there are a lot of sewer gases, other things that could come up, as well as dead legs to some of the facilities if they're not being used, need to be cleared.
Perfect. I'm looking through the rest of the questions here, Richard, and you can help me out if you can. Most of these questions relate to mechanical code and plumbing code. I'm wondering if we have Dave back on the call, and I don't see his name in the list of attendees.
Yeah, he said he's trying to get back on. He got kicked off by our internet security, timed out on him, so he's trying to get back in. There's one here about accessibility for the foot-operated hand washing facilities. The answer is basically no. You can't use the foot controls anymore.
Perfect. And we have another good question. It goes back to it's a basic question, wanting to know what is the OSHPD 1 designation.
Good question. We actually have seminars just on that. Basically, OSHPD 1R is a designation we've given to buildings that are removed from acute care service. You might commonly hear them referred to as RACS project. Removed, RACS, removed from acute care service. That is a way that we're tracking these buildings because they remain under OSHPD jurisdiction if it's a 1R. So we track the building in our system by identifying them as 1R. What's important to remember is that any of the utilities that are serving that building, if it's coming from a hospital or is part of a hospital, require the same requirements of a hospital for that. But if the occupants going in, depending on the occupancy going in, that's going to be based on the type of occupancy going in. So there is a question about like equipment anchorage. should a 1R apply to all equipment anchorage in a hospital building? And the answer is no. If you have administrative building or uses within that space, you do not have the same equipment anchorage requirements. That's going to be for a B occupancy. So you use the equipment anchorage requirements for model code. If you have a skilled nursing facility going in, you use the occupancy requirements for OSHPD 2 would be applied to that. Again, the services coming in would be part of the OSHPD 1R building, but the actual uses in the space would remain per the groups. A good example, this is OSHPD 3, putting a clinic space in, it's going to be OSHPD 3. You want the same requirements, for the HVAC, the electrical, and all the planning for an OSHPD 3. If it's an unlicensed clinic space, you're going to have different requirements for that space. So you do have to be aware that if you want to switch over at another time, that you may have to bring them up to OSHPD 3 requirements. So it's something to keep in mind for future planning. But there's going to be a lot of different uses in the OSHPD 1R buildings, and so the requirements for the spaces are by the occupancy.
Good. Great, Richard. I got another question for you. Do we anticipate changes to fuel requirements in SNFs in California, or will we continue to follow model code?
For SNFs, you're still going to use OSHPD 2 for skilled nursing facilities. I'm not seeing that question on here. Can you repeat the question?
The bottom. Yeah, it's towards the bottom, and it's from Jonathan. And the question reads: do we anticipate changes to fuel requirements for SNFs in California?
Sorry, I didn't read. Yes. I didn't hear the whole thing. Do we anticipate changes? I anticipate them. Yes. Are they happening? No. Right now, there is an allowance in the CMS that provides for the fuel requirements to be 96 hours, but there is a option to be able to provide refueling in an emergency. So you have to have an emergency plan in place to provide the refueling, and you can go to a lesser amount of fuel. I believe it's 6 hours on that. The legislature is still looking at that. There was a bill last year that did not make it through, and so I do think this will continue to be addressed at various levels. So you just have, as of right now, we're going as we have been.
Okay, and I'm looking again. We want to take this opportunity to thank you for submitting questions. It seems like we're having a bit of an issue having Dave log back in. So for those questions that are specific to mechanical and plumbing, what we will do is we will go ahead and answer those questions specifically in an email to you, as we have your email address. We got that once you logged in and registered for the event. So if Dave is not able to come back on, we'll go ahead and send those out to you individually for those questions that were asked, and want to encourage you, if you're still there, to go ahead and submit more questions that may be related to structural existing building code, maybe 1R, so we can go ahead and take advantage of this opportunity to provide those answers for you.
Yeah. Dave says he's on, but he doesn't have audio yet, so he may hopefully be joining us here again. There are a couple other questions.
This is Dave. Can you guys hear me?
We can now.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah, thanks. The system is really going sideways on me there.
You gotta love technology, Dave.
Yeah, I do see there's a lot of questions, and I'm eager to help answer them. I've got about 10 minutes left, and so however we're going to answer those long term for everybody, I'm all in on that.
That's great, Dave. First question for you we have is related to the mechanical code, section 306.2. How would you expect engineers to prove this? Okay, if just mentioned in the spec, or want it on the control diagrams, or SO spelled out on the plans?
Yes, this is in reality, this is a capability that's already in this equipment that we deal with, right? Especially these large boilers and chillers. They all have hand controls, at least from everyone that I've seen. My recommendation would be stated specifically on the design documents that this capability has to be there. That's it. I mean, that's the end of the argument for us. We just want to see that it's there, and hopefully that answers the question. And it's not the best code the way this is written, but it's a capability that OSHPD wanted, so we have it in there. So
Great. I got another question. I got a list of questions for you, Dave. So we'll go ahead and try to get these as fast as possible. So in section 3,
I won't answer any of Glenn's questions. I'm kidding.
Well, again, I believe
right.
Glenn is left, but he did ask some great questions. Next question reads,
Yeah, he did.
320.4, does this apply to both intermediate distribution facilities, IDF, and main distribution facilities, MDF?
Yeah, the intent of that language, from what I remember in our earliest discussions, it was MDF mainly. It was the main IT rooms. That said, we'll probably have a little more discussion on that. It's a great question. I'm going to verify what I just said a little later. Yeah.
Dave, this is Bill Gow.
Can you
Yeah,
hear me?
it's for the main distribution frame.
Yeah,
That
was the intent of it.
that is why we changed the name for that room. That room is defined in the building code
Mm-hmm.
in 1224.5.
Yeah.
And it is your main distribution frame.
Great.
Yes. Thank you,
Another
Bill.
question.
Yes, sir.
Got another question for the team. When you have an OSHPD 3 building, do we need to comply with the Title 24, Chapter 6 Energy, which says 15 CFM per person, and then a CFM per square foot, whichever is greater?
Going to try to answer that one, you guys?
Yeah,
This is Dave.
energy code
Yeah,
energy code does apply. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, for your standard OSHPD facilities, there's an exemption for ventilation requirements as they're listed in Part 6. Okay. As a default, we avoid that and go to our requirements specifically for medical facilities. Now, OSHPD 3 facilities historically have been held to Part 6 requirements as reviewed by the locals. Now, there's a little hiccup in that coverage, right? Richard, maybe you want to chime in on that, but they are under the blanket right now with the exemptions offered to all the other OSHPD facilities, and there are multiple exemptions for that.
Yeah, alterations to healthcare facilities are currently exempt under Section 141 of Part 6.
Yes.
Green and Part 11 still applies.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
Okay.
Great. Thank you both. I got a question related to ventilation air. The question reads, does ventilation air require or prohibit operable windows in a hospital occupancy, or neither?
Oh, yeah. I love that question. I love that question because I actually I'm really in favor of operable windows in a hospital, but you're going to have to argue that with our architects a little bit, like I do. And natural ventilation right now does not apply for these facilities. Okay. That said, I don't think it means that we cannot have operable windows. It just does not count as ventilation.
Correct.
Anybody else can chime in on that? Okay.
I agree with you, Dave.
Okay. That's a great question.
Great. We got another ventilation question. This question reads, in section 402.1.3, ventilation in healthcare facilities, which additions and associated agenda of ASHRAE 170 and 62.1 are adopted and applicable?
Okay. Another great question. In order to meet CMS requirements, it's ASHRAE 170 2008. It's the very first version of ASHRAE 170, which none of us really like because there's all kinds of nice advancements beyond that. OSHPD has specifically adopted ASHRAE 170 2013 through addendum AE. We have that specifically in the code right there in that section of the mechanical code. For all intents and purposes, there really are no conflicts for ventilation requirements between that version and the official 2008 version. So to answer that quickly, it's a very early version of ASHRAE 170. So hopefully that answers that.
Great. This is a kind of an involved question for you, Dave. So no 100% 0A. So how does one remodel a legacy 100% 0A system when required to rebalance per CAN 2-102.6 if its ACH is not on the list?
Okay, that's a great question. You know, the extent to which you have to comply with new current codes or the code that the facility was designed under depends on the extent of the scope of the project in the remodel work per the remodel CAN. That's clear as mud, I know. And but we always work with read the text of remodel CAN carefully for that, and we'll always work with designers and healthcare providers to come up with the best commonsensical approach on a remodel. Now, the opening statement there that there's no 100% outdoor air systems, please understand that's actually not true. We do not prohibit 100% outdoor air systems. We encourage them. We like them. If I were designing a hospital, that's what I would design to. So code does not prohibit those. What was prohibited was air change rates that are below the ASHRAE 170 requirements. So it's a great question, and it came up a lot when we were drafting that change. Thanks for that.
Yeah. And I'd like to add on to that is kind of, yeah, when he's referring to the remodel CAN, if it was designed per that, Dave's correct, it's going to depend on the extent of the remodel. Otherwise, it remains as is. You can continue to use the original design requirements from when it was originally permitted, if it was permitted in compliance.
That was a great question and great clarification from you both. So thank you. We have another mechanical question related to a boiler that is not listed for alcove installation. Does it still require to comply with the CMC Chapter 3, specifically CMC 303.0?
The 303.0 I'd have to look at. I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me, but I don't know if the commenter can add to that.
Great.
It obviously would not apply to anything we've lined out. Any chance I can answer that one later?
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. So, Warren, if you're there, please clarify that question, and we'll move on to the next.
I appreciate the question.
Thanks, Dave. Lavatory non-porous materials. Does this mean that lavatory fixtures set in countertops cannot have any porous material in the countertop, such as a practical board under the plastic laminate?
Particle board.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Particle, yeah. Yeah, that's, I welcome Richard's input on this. The surface is what we're worried about there in terms of non-porous. You know, as a mechanical, I love flowing clean water and porcelain. But as far as the countertops, Richard, I think a laminated that's non-porous would be the requirement here. Lamination.
Yeah, it almost reads like it's the lab itself. But I was looking that one up.
Yeah.
I lost my question box.
Yeah.
Never mind, found it. It closed up on me.
Yeah, to have something around a handler fixture that's porous would be sounds like it would be not good design. But
Yeah.
hopefully we've answered that.
As it relates to the auto shutoff, does 1304.1.3 mean auto shutoff or seismic?
Oh yeah. That was in terms of the MedGas system notes that we were talking about. Now, if you look at it, if you look at NFPA 99 for Class 1 medical gas systems, there is zero mention of automatic shutoffs. They don't even address it, and there's a reason for that, I believe. Even though I'm not on the committee for that. You're not going to have automatic shutoffs on MedGas systems that keep people alive in surgeries and otherwise. Because I think the concern that with NFPA 99 was malfunctions or shutting things off and killing people. So no auto shutoffs that I know of at all.
Right, and sticking with MedGas, why can't OSHPROD 3 building have MedGas located in an OSHPROD 3 building?
Yeah, and that's a great question. If you read the language of that code change carefully, I believe, you'll note that you can provide gas to an OSHPOD 3 from an OSHPOD 3. One of the big issues there is we don't share OSHPOD 3 versus OSHPOD 1 mainly due to jurisdiction issues. We've always had concerns that an OSHPD clinic would go in with a hyperbaric service center, for example. And you ever seen one of those? They're fascinating. I've been involved in them. But they can have, if it's an OSHPD 3, the jurisdiction is such that the load can vary wildly. And we'd never know about it at OSHPD, and you'd be serving both OSHPD 1 and 3, and it would impact the system. So, but you can't have source OSHPD or MedGas sources within the OSHPD 3 serving the OSHPD 3. Same thing with a 1R. Okay. So hopefully I've answered that.
Great. And we have a lot of great questions, Dave. Thank you for your input, and Richard as well. Sticking with the MedGas topic, if MedGas Systems is serving only OSHPD 3 building and the facility has no OSHPD 1 or 2, can the MedGas system still remain in an OSHPD 3 building?
Yeah, I think I just answered that. Yeah.
Perfect.
Mhm.
Now, moving on to humidity control. In general, humidity control has been applied for sensitive area. CMC 2019 Table 4A has indicated relative humidity range for a lot of rooms that are not listed as the sensitive area. Please clarify if the humidity control is required for non-sensitive area or room that is not listed on section 322.0.
Yeah, a great question. Just so you know, if you look at the text showing relative humidity requirements in Table 4A, you'll notice that the text on those is almost entirely, all of those are straight text, okay? That means they're model code. They're right out of ASHRAE 170. So they're in there so that the facility and the designer of the facility will comply with ASHRAE 170. That's why those are in there. Those are taken right out of the national standard. We specifically are not necessarily requiring controls in those spaces that are non-sensitive that have those listings, but understand that numbers on Table 4A indicate that we need the facility to be able to provide those conditions. It doesn't mean that it has to be run all the time within those conditions. Okay, that's a great question. And it gets pretty involved. So feel free to follow up with me later via email if you want more clarification on that. I appreciate that one.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for the question. And I'll go ahead and plug that email address one more time. regsunit@oshpod.ca.gov. Now, dealing with under-counter lavatories, Dave, does an under-counter mounted lavatory comply with the requirements of CPC section 210.02B?
I believe that it does. I believe that it does, and that's once again, I can follow up more on that. I've never heard that question before. And it's a great question. I don't remember ever seeing one that was under counter mounted. But I'd like to learn more about it by answering this question later if I can.
Great. Next question deals with more of a clarification, if you will. For OSHPD 5 applications, a solid surface anti-ligature lavatory fixture is a typical specification in lieu of stainless steel fixtures. It appears that the solid surface fixtures no longer conform based on the requirements of CPC section 210.02D as in door. Please confirm.
I don't have that in front of me. D, can somebody bring that up or?
Yeah, it's basically your example. It's a psych facility from the gooseneck requirement.
Yeah, and there is model code language in the plumbing code specifically calling out for psych facilities you have non-ligature. So hopefully that answers that. It is exempt from that.
Great. And this question is from one of our own, Gene. The question reads, for redundancy of water heaters, if a facility has boilers and multiple storage tanks, do the tanks have to reflect the same redundancy requirements? For example, 3 water storage tanks and 1 tank develops a leak and needs to be replaced. Should it be able to be removed without having to cut into the interfering water lines? Also, would this apply equally to SNFs as to GAC hospitals?
Okay, whether or not it can be designed or replace a tank without adversely affecting the associated piping really is a design issue. You'd want to have valves in there such that you could service and or remove a tank without affecting the system for very long. You know, you'd have temporary dead ends that are not allowed right now in hot water systems. There is language in ASHRAE 170 about redundancy of boilers providing hot water. And I'm sorry, I don't have that verbiage off the top of my head right now specifically. But hopefully I'm answering that question. You know, redundancy is very, very simple. If you take one thing out, the rest of the remaining stuff has to be able to carry the load. Now, in terms of, there are some standalone like instantaneous water heaters where we have storage tanks associated with those water heaters. The redundancy in that case does apply to the tanks. Like if you have 3 instantaneous water heaters all filling one tank, well, if that tank goes down, now you're not serving the facility correctly. And I hope that makes sense. Very good question. It does come up once in a while.
Yeah, so that brings up something that I wanted to mention. If we read the answer and we provide the answer to the question, and it still doesn't make sense, or you still want to have a further discussion, please email us at regsunit@oshpa.ca.gov. Next question reads: so all lavatories are to be provided with gooseneck faucets, and regardless of application?
No, laboratories, no. Go ahead, Richard. You're going to say something?
No, I was probably going to say the same thing. Is there's exceptions, and they're clearly identified. That hasn't changed. The requirement of the gooseneck fountain hasn't changed. It's just the design of the gooseneck has been clarified. Correct?
That's correct. Yeah. Now, in terms of the configuration of the hand wash fixture itself, that's controlled by the footnotes in Table 4.2 of the plumbing code, and that hasn't changed. So you have 3 different levels. You have a non-touch, which is for surgery center scrub sinks, for example. You have a standard hand wash fixture, which you'd find often in, let's say, an anteroom or a nurse station. Then you have the low grade, I would call it, which is standard control, which you'd find in like a public laboratory type of installation. So check that out. Check out the footnotes in Table 4.2 of the plumbing code.
Great, thank you.
It's not an easy read, so go ahead with that.
Again, some of these questions are pretty involved, and you're referencing specific code sections. So if we provide an answer and you still need clarification, please contact us, and we'd be happy to have that conversation with you. Next, Richard, I believe this question is for you, dealing with call systems. For call systems, what is the definition of non-attached?
And that is where?
Richard, this is Bill. I think they're referring to the nurse call system.
That's what I'm thinking too.
And I don't understand non-attached. So I need more help to be able to answer that question. So.
Right. So that's a good opportunity. Charles, if you're there, please email us at that email address that we've shared for further clarification and have that discussion. So going back to the plumbing code, would CPC section 323.0 also apply to plumbing fixtures with respect to having their noted in the plumbing fixture schedule, or is it exclusive to equipment only?
I'm drawing a blank on what's being asked there. I'd have to. Let me see here. I'm sorry. Can we go on to the next one? I'm going to try to bring this up as we continue on. Okay.
Yeah. I'm looking at this. The only reference we have to something not attached in here is regarding refrigeration for technology equipment centers, not attached to a patient care area. When it says not attached, it means not serving. Correct? So not serving a patient care area.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, I believe so. Well, let's say not attached. For the refrigeration?
It says for technology equipment centers not attached to a patient care area.
Yeah. What we're trying to address there is sometimes you can have imaging rooms that have a computer support room next to them, and those are starting to go away. But we didn't want to have a room where you have a patient in managing in imaging equipment and have a room right next to it with a lot of refrigeration serving the room.
Perfect.
Question. Okay.
Yeah. Hopefully we've answered all of the questions that were typed into the GoTo panel question box. We have one last question that we're going to go over, Dave, and I believe what the individual is asking for is boiler room size. Is there a definition or a minimum requirement for that?
No, from what I remember, what we've done with the code language, we really avoided that. We're looking for clearances as required for fire safety, and we're looking for the installation of the boilers to be per the listing. Okay, and that kind of mimics what was done in the newer NFPA guidance. So
Great, thank you.
It's a good question.
Yes. Go ahead, Richard.
I'd say there's another question about section 321, referencing OSHPD 3, and then it's surgical clinics. Basically, 321 does include OSHPD 3 surgical clinics. 321.1 does not, but the remainder of 321 does apply to. Only 321.1 is exempt from the surgical clinic requirement.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the question read, 321.0 has OSHPD 3 surgical clinics only, when then 321.1 states does not apply. Which is it? And
Right, and 321.2, et cetera, does apply.
Yeah. Yeah, welcome to learning code language. It's not an easy read at times. That's an example.
Yeah, it's not an easy read, and that's why we here at OSHPD like to offer our contact information. If you read the code and it's still not clear, or just want to have a conversation about a specific project that you're looking for help on, send us an email, and we'd be happy to reach out to you and have that conversation as we move along. So, Richard, if I captured all the questions, I'd like to go ahead and close out this presentation.
Yep.
Want to go ahead and thank everyone for joining us here at the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development. Please log on to our website and look for upcoming webinars and training sessions that we have on our website under the webinar section, presentation materials section as well. So with that being said, we want to thank you for taking the time today for joining us on this presentation. We did handle some technology issues, and thank you for hanging on and being here with us. So until next time, thank you for joining us, and thank you for doing your part in providing access to safe, quality healthcare environments within California.